You first come to be exposed to Richard Matheson and his work?
Well, I was exposed to it before I knew who Richard Matheson was, like a lot of us were, because I
Sure.
watched Twilight Zone. Sorry about that. That'll stop.
Okay.
But I watched the Twilight Zone when I was still a lad growing up in New York. So I had seen Richard Matheson stories without knowing that I was seeing Richard Matheson stories. And then, as I got a little bit older, you start, if you grow up, we didn't have the term in the 60s. We didn't have the term that's quite common now, monster kid. Kids who grew up with that kind of shared background of watching the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits and getting the monster magazines and building monster models. All of my 13 Aurora monster models are over here,
Yeah.
still here with me. We were just horror fans. We now that generation kind of refers to themselves as the monster kids.
Sure.
So if you grew up with that and then you start to look at credits, you start to realize that there's this fellow named Richard Matheson, and you start to put things together. Then a seminal moment for me was the first airing of the NightStalker in January of 1972, and that really propelled me forward into knowing who Richard Matheson was and how important he was. And Richard Matheson continues to cross a lot of people who I read. I read Rod Serling. I read Ray Bradbury, and of course he knew both of them and was close to both of them. He was friends with both of them. So, there was almost an inevitable quality to this of propelling forward that is. And then, when you start to read Richard Matheson. I mean, and I think most people who know Richard Matheson, are exposed to Richard Matheson through the film and television adaptations of it.
Sure.
Of which there are many. And, you could sometimes, there are some writers who, they get bigger and bigger the more you put their credits together. Some people's careers are very linear, like a Hitchcock. Hitchcock always thrillers, and it's very easy to get a grasp on Hitchcock's career. Other directors like Robert Wise, who worked in a lot of different genres and worked in a lot of different media, he's a little harder to get to because, he wasn't just a one type of form director, one genre director. But when you start to put Robert Wise's credits together, he always becomes more impressive than some of the people who get all of the acclaim. And I think Richard Matheson's like that, is that when you start to put all of the credits together and then you read him and you really realize you're dealing with, something that I have said, and I'll stand by it, is that you're not just dealing with a major horror writer or a major science fiction writer or whatever. You're dealing with a major American writer who should be better read, better appreciated, and his work and what he did and what he dealt with, what he used those forms to deal with are really remarkable. And like I said, I think it's a vastly underrated career. A lot of people made this point. This point is not original to me, but I have made it often enough because I think it's a very powerful one. Is that when somebody says to me, "Oh, Richard Matheson, I don't think I know that name." Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And then I will say, the gremlin on the wing in the Twilight Zone. Oh, I love that episode.
Right.
Woman who's at the farmhouse, who's, his house is being invaded by aliens. Oh, yeah. And then you start saying, like Somewhere in Time or, What Dreams May Come.
Right.
Legend or The Shrinking Man. And you start putting all this stuff together, NightStalker. And
Even Star Trek.
There's a chance. Yes, there's Star Trek. There's a chance that you have been touched by a Richard Matheson story at some point, even if you are unaware of it. And that doesn't even start to talk about the influence he has on the generation going forward. So even if that weren't true, you'd still be influenced by Richard Matheson because he had a profound influence on everything going forward. So it was somewhat inevitable for me that I would, there seems to be a path that leads to Richard, and you said, so whoever had pointed you in my direction, that person said, he's the expert on all things Matheson. That's not true. I am an expert on a lot of things, Richard Matheson. But Richard's career was so big, so huge, that there are people who have done very, very deep dives into various aspects of his career. And there are several of us who are Richard Matheson experts in some ways. And Richard and I talked over the years a lot about certain titles on his resume.
Sure.
There are some things we didn't talk about, or I didn't research so deeply, because my association with Richard, then the second part, the other part of your question might be, how did that relationship, how did that path from childhood meet to, meeting the man himself? And
Absolutely, yeah. I'd love to hear that.
Because in the late 80s, I'd written a book on the Columbo series.
Okay.
The Columbo Phile, and it was done. It was finished. It hadn't been published yet, but it was on its way. And I was already thinking about the next book. And the next book was going to be a book I was going to do with Ray Bradbury. And I'd gotten to know Ray, and I wanted to do a book which I was going to title Kaleidoscope, which is the title of one of his short stories. And it was going to look at all of the adaptations of Ray's work into other media. So it would look at the film, TV, radio, stage, comic book, all things that were the adapted works of Ray Bradbury. And Ray would do running commentary throughout the book. And I was working on this for a few years with him, and we had got very deep on certain subjects. We had gotten very, very deep on we talked a lot about, for instance, Something Wicked This Way Comes. We talked a lot about The Illustrated Man, but one of the topics we talked about was The Martian Chronicles, the miniseries, and Richard Matheson had done the teleplay for that miniseries, and Ray did not like the way the miniseries came out, but he never blamed Richard because he thought the script was good. He just didn't like the direction. He thought where it went wrong was the direction. But in any event, I was because I was a TV critic for many, many years for the Akron Beacon Journal and then the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And I was in California for a press conference for a TV movie. I think this was 1989, but I'm not positive. But it was for a TV movie Richard had written about L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz. It was called The Dreamer of Oz. John Ritter played L. Frank Baum.
Oh, okay.
Cloris Leachman and Ned O'Toole were in the cast, and they had a press conference for this at the Century Plaza Hotel in Century City. And Richard was on the panel, and I had never met him, but my first intention was to talk to him about the Martian Chronicles. That's what I wanted to, so I introduced myself in the lobby of the meeting room afterwards, told him that I knew Ray, knew he was a friend with Ray, and told him I wanted to talk about the Martian Chronicles. And he was very gracious and said, yes, absolutely, And then very quickly, what happened was that book got sidetracked, and Ray was on to other projects. I was on to other projects, and we never got back to it. I still have all those interviews. I was
in the trunk.
It's somewhere in this labyrinthian office. This Bradbury material. But what happened was I was going to do another book after the Columbo book came out. That deal that I had to do, that book fell apart. And it was at that moment that a publisher, a small publisher, called me up and said, hey, listen, I saw your Columbo book. I really loved it. And I was just wondering, have you ever thought about doing the same type of book on the NightStalker? And I said, well, I love the NightStalker. I was, I became a journalist because of Carl Kolchak and that movie. And I was 15 years old when it aired. It had a profound impact on me. I said, but I didn't know that there was a publisher crazy enough to do a book on the NightStalker. I'm crazy enough to do it. And he came in at just the right time. I mean, I've just, these other books had sort of gone off the rails a little bit. I was looking for something to do. And I said, well, listen, I'll tell you what. I said, there were four major kind of contributors to that. Darren McGavin, obviously, who played Carl Kolchak. Jeff Rice, who wrote the original book and created the character, Carl Kolchak, Richard Matheson, who adapted that book into that incredible TV movie, and Dan Curtis, who produced it. If I can get the four of them to cooperate with this, I'll call them and get in touch with them. And very quickly, all four of them signed on. And it was the writing of that book, which was called NightStalking, which was how I got to know Richard, was how I really got to know
Okay.
Richard Matheson.
That's fascinating as well. And I think Richard Matheson, it almost comes across as his influence is much more prolific than he ever was as a writer and as an individual, which from everything I've gathered, that seems to be the way he liked it as well. I think he kind of liked being the guy behind the scenes, sort of pushing all that influence forward. And,
I got to be very, it's odd because the first person I sort of became friends with in the early 80s was Ray Bradbury.
Yeah.
And then later on, I became very good friends with Richard and Harlan Ellison.
Okay.
Both friends with Ray. But I got closer, actually, in those later years with Harlan. And Harlan and I were friends from 1985 when he was working on the revival of the Twilight Zone for CBS, all the way till the end. And Richard and I got to know each other better throughout the working process. So I got closer to the two of them. And I think it's interesting because although it started with Ray, Richard and Harlan were sort of polar opposites. They were very good friends, and they certainly admired each other's writing greatly. But you could not have two more different personalities. They were kind of a Mutt and Jeff team anyway, because Richard was very tall and Harlan was very short. Richard was very soft spoken. Harlan was not soft spoken.
You're right. He's legendary.
Yes. And Harlan, his shtick was, he was practically a stand-up comedian. Richard had a great sense of humor. He's very funny, but he was sly funny. He was sneaky funny. He'd be talking and you'd realize he had gotten it in before you knew it. Harlan was very out there and very, but Richard was laid back and very, very quiet. And he was not one to sort of say, hey, look what I did. Look what I did.
Right.
He was very, and not that he wasn't proud of what he had done, and not that he didn't, take credit for what he had done, but he was not somebody who would force his personality on you in any ways. And yet, I think, if you look at Harlan's writing, which is wonderful, and if you look at Ray Bradbury's writing, they're wonderful, and you can imitate them if you wish. And I think a lot of people go through phases where you go through your Bradbury phase and you imitate Bradbury's style, and you might go through a phase where you imitate Harlan's style. It's hard to read Harlan, as Stephen King once said. It's hard to read Harlan after a while and then not try to write like him. But then you very kind of quickly realize, those are very distinctive voices and very, easily imitated but not mastered. Yeah, very difficult to actually, master anything. And then he's just an imitation of it. Richard, in some ways, is more influential because his writing is a model of how to write spare, how to write with a lot of intensity, how to write. There's no wasted words with Richard. There's no, so many people say they were influenced by Richard's writing, and you can see it. And one of the best things that anybody ever said to me is another writer of that generation, who was another good friend of Richard's and somebody I wish I had known better, but I didn't. I only got a chance to talk to him a couple times, was Robert Bloch. And Robert Bloch, I interviewed him in Crystal City, the lobby of a hotel in Crystal City in, I think, 1993. And we were talking about Bloch's career. We were talking about Psycho. We were talking about, Thriller. We were talking about all the things that he had done. And I said something to the effect of, it was a pretty dismal question, actually. It was a prosaic question, but it got a great answer because I asked him, what advice he would give to young writers, to somebody just starting out. What advice would he give? And he said, when it comes to the actual craft of writing, there's little that can be said that hasn't already been said. he said, but I would say to anybody who said they wanted to write, and not just write horror or science fiction or anything else, just want to write, read Richard Matheson. He is the perfect model for if you want to learn how to write. Now, that's a hell of a comment. Coming
Absolutely.
from Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, who is in every way, the equal, the peer, and a very good friend, a very close friend, of Richard. Harlan told me that when Bob Bloch was dying, and everybody loved Robert Bloch, he was a great guy, give you his last dime, but that when Bob Bloch was dying, Richard Matheson and his wife, and Harlan and his wife Susan, went over to spend an evening with Robert Bloch and his wife. So the six of them were sitting around talking, and I think, what would you want to have a record of that conversation?
No kidding. Just to be that little fly on the wall with the world's smallest tape recorder.
Right. So in the room, you have Bob Bloch, who knows he's dying. He's reconciled to the fact, and he's got, two of his best friends is Harlan Ellison and Richard Matheson in the room. So, but anyway, the book Night Stalking came out. Richard was very pleased with the way it came out, and that kind of started a conversation. I redid. I did a new version of that book in 1997.
Okay.
Called The NightStalker Companion. And, so that led to further conversations. And then, I think what really propelled it forward was really Barry Hoffman, who you mentioned, is Barry wanted to do a book which would collect the Kolchak scripts that Richard had written. And not just The NightStalker, and not just the sequel, The Night Strangler, but also the third movie, the unfilmed third movie that he'd written with Bill Nolan, The Night Killers. So, I interviewed, this meant I had to go back to Richard to freshen up things and do some conversations and things like this.
Sure.
And so that book was published, and it was a very high-end book, as sometimes, Barry is wont to do. It was published in 2003 as Richard Matheson's Kolchak scripts. And it's a huge book. It's an immense, but it did have all three scripts. But I decided when this book became a reality, I decided, well, how many chances are you going to have in your life to collaborate with Richard Matheson? So I decided this was going to be my ultimate statement on this writer who had meant so much to me and I'd gotten to know. And so I put all different kinds of introductions and essays in this book. I said everything I wanted to say about Richard, about, his work on TV. As Richard would have told you, he'd be the first to told you that in many ways his work on television was more rewarding, less profitable, but more rewarding than his work in film.
Interesting.
And that if you look at the TV movies in particular, Duel, NightStalker, an underrated movie that he wrote called The Morning After, which is nothing. It's just about a study in alcoholism that Van Dyke starred in, and it's an incredible movie. Trilogy of Terror. If you look at the TV movies, they stack up.
Yeah.
The movies, so he was very, very pleased with the track record, particularly the TV movie realm. So this book, I decided this was going to be my ultimate. I wasn't going to pull anything back. Everything I wanted to say about Richard, I was going to say, and I did. And I was, the only thing I was not pleased with this book was the price tag. It was a very expensive book, and that was not Barry's fault. It was actually ABC charged a lot for the rights to reproduce the script, and they would not budge on it. So he had to ask quite a bit on this one. So that was the unfortunate part. But anyway, that book was published in 2003, and it certainly deepened because it was a chance to talk in depth with Richard about a lot of different things in his career, like TV movies. And then, I figured, well, okay, the universe gave you that. And after that, Richard would call every once in a while, or I would call him if the time was good, and we would just talk. And after that, it just became, hey, how you doing type of stuff. During one of these conversations, I said to him, and I was not saying this for because remember, I had done my Richard Matheson book.
Right.
But I said to him, and he, by the way, he did not like being called Dick Matheson. Rod Serling called him Dick Matheson. Dan Curtis always referred to him as Dick Matheson. He did not like that. He let them do it, and that's what kind of the world called him that. But he preferred, he preferred Rich, or Richard. And I always called, after you get past the point of calling somebody Mr. Matheson, and and I always called him Richard, and he always said, you and my wife are the only ones who refer to me as Rich, and he preferred that.
Which is funny, yeah. I guess that just goes to show his personality that he had. He was just such a humble, kind, giving man that clearly never saw himself as this, bigger than life, imposing icon that the rest of the world sees him as.
Oh yeah, and if you go back and you look at any interview that Dan Curtis did or Rod Serling did, and they refer to him, they always say, "Oh, Dick Matheson is a great guy. Dick Matheson is this wonderful guy." It's like
who?
He didn't like it. He was not crazy about that. So, but he kind of let it stand and say, But at one point, in these conversations, I said offhandedly, have you ever thought of collecting all of your vampire stories into one book? And there was a pause, and he said, typical Richard, right? It isn't much. Yeah, it is. And he said, no, it's really not a lot of stuff. And I said, Richard, your name is on 3 of arguably the most important vampire stories of all time. You wrote the adaptation of Dracula, and that script got mangled because it was supposed to have been done at 3 hours, and it was supposed to be much more faithful to Stoker's novel. And at the last second, just pretty much when they were getting ready to leave to film overseas, when Dan was ready to get everybody backed up, CBS cut their order from 3 hours to 2. And they had to rewrite it on the fly. It's incredible. If you like that version of Dracula, which I do, and you like Jack Palance's Dracula, which I do, you just ache to see what they really wanted to do with it, because they were forced to make massive changes in the story, and they had to do it all on the fly. They had to do it practically as the cameras were rolling. So
how do you do that, right? Take it to 30% of the whole movie and try to
it was horribly compromised. But Richard's original script exists. So I said, it'd be great for the world to see what you wanted to do with Dracula. So I said, your name is on Dracula, the NightStalker, and of course, I Am Legend is the most important story, a vampire story written between Dracula in 1897 and today. Whenever today happens to be, it'll still be the most important vampire book written between now and Dracula. And I said, then there are the short stories, like Blood Sun and No Such Thing as a Vampire and The Funeral. I said, it's not inconsiderable, and he just kind of went, I don't think it's that much. So, and on top of everything else, he always claimed he didn't like vampires. Somebody who spent a lot of time in the company of vampires, he always said, vampires are, I don't know why they make them romantic. They're terrible, foul creatures with bad breath who sleep in the dirt. Why does anybody make them? So,
point.
Yeah, and he does have a point, and when he does write his vampire, he does not romanticize them. He goes the exact opposite direction. But So that was, I figured, okay, well, that's, I took my shot. I thought that would be a good idea, Yeah. And I can still remember this because I was in California at the time. I was actually in a bookstore. I think it was a Barnes & Noble in Westwood. And my cell phone goes off, and it's Richard. And he said, listen, I've been thinking about that that book you proposed. And it got me thinking. And I went out into the garage and I found my script for I Am Legend. And I said, "What script for I Am Legend?" He said, "The script I wrote for Hammer Horror Films." "What script you wrote for Hammer Horror?" Now, I know he had written a script. I knew that the first version of I Am Legend, The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, had carried the pseudonym he used when he did not like the Logan Swanson pseudonym. So I knew he had worked on a script but I had not known, and with everything I knew about Richard, I had not known that he had written an adaptation for Hammer in the 50s, and that it was called The Night Killers. That one came absolutely out of the blue for me.
Yeah, talk about a hammer dropping.
Yeah. The Night Creatures, not that I was thinking of the third Kolchak film when I said Night Killers. The Night Creatures. So he said, I think with this screenplay, maybe we have a book. And I said, "Well, what do you mean we?" He said, "Well, you're going to edit it." And I thought, I've already said everything I want to say. And that was foolish, because you can never stop saying things about Richard. When I actually, rolled up my sleeves and got to work on that book, I realized I had a lot to say about Richard Matheson. So what we did was we took his original Dracula script, and he not only had his original Dracula script, it had all of his handwritten. If you look at the way it was reproduced, it had all of his handwritten notes.
Oh, wow.
He changed it and edited it. So we had his Dracula script and his screen treatment for Dracula. Not only the script, but the screen treatment. We had the novel form of I Am Legend and the screenplay. We had the short stories in there.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you real quick. The difference between the script and the screen treatment, that is that more once the script is done, they kind of go over that once more to make any changes as far as how it's going to be performed?
You mean the screen treatment? Well, the screen treatment is kind of like your statement of purpose.
Oh,
it's part of what it's bigger than a pitch, but it's not like a full proposal or something like that. It's your statement of intent.
Okay.
And Richard Richard being Richard, it's a piece of literature, the screen treatment, because he talks about the importance of Dracula in the screen treatment. He talks about the importance of it really is wonderful, because this is the opening of his screen treatment. If at long last Dracula is to be filmed authentically, two major points must be kept in mind. The first of these is that Dracula became a classic because of its enduring fascination to readers since its publication in 1897, and he's off to the races. Yeah. So, this is Richard. He's doing a real piece of writing, and it's like a long essay is what it is. It's an outline of the story. It's his whole outline of what he views the story and how he's going to do it, and then you have the full script in here. And then you have the full novel of I Am Legend. Then you have his screenplay in here, and then you have the short stories. So if you know the short stories, they are Blood Sun, which was published under the title Drink My Red Blood, which was a title Richard hated. So his original title, Blood Sun, The Funeral and No Such Thing as a Vampire. And then the other thing I did was I went to, we went to various people to write appreciations of Richard. So in this book, you not only get my essays and introductions, you not only get all of Richard's vampire stories, but then we went to various people like Mick Garris, John Carpenter, Ray Bradbury, Richard Christian Matheson, Richard's son, a fine writer on his own, Roxy O'Bannon, and they all wrote appreciations of Richard. But the trick of this book was, and we called it Bloodlines. There it is.
Okay, and that's still available. Is there still copies left, I believe, through Gauntlet?
It probably pretty pricey if you, once again, this thing, you need a crane to pick this thing up. But Bloodlines, when we got all those appreciations, it was a top secret operation. We didn't tell Richard we were doing it. We wanted them to be a surprise, that when we sent him the first copy of the book and he picked it up, there would be all these wonderful things, and it allowed me to renew acquaintances with Ray Bradbury, because the last appreciation in this is Ray. And the appreciation he wrote is he found a fan letter that he had sent to Richard on the publication of Richard's first short story.
Wow.
Their first horror science fiction short story being published. So he wrote this amazing fan letter, and he was already established. He was already, Ray was already the bigger writer by a long shot.
Yeah, it's just insane to consider that.
So he sent this amazing fan letter to Richard, and in order to update it for the book, he just scrawled on it. When he sent it to me, he just scrawled on the words, "It looks like I was right." So that was a great contribution. And we didn't tell Richard,
Yeah.
And we even sent him a copy of the galleys to correct without the appreciations. So he would not know. So I felt really good about myself. I feel, I double crossed him, in a good way.
Right.
But Richard was
the surprise.
Richard was such an amazing, exacting. This will tell you how exacting he was. It came to a point when we had to decide on the dedication for the book, and I suggested, when we did this book in 2006, the previous year, both Dan Curtis and Darren McGavin had died, and they had died within a few weeks of each other. But I think they died about a month apart. So when it came time to do, I said to Richard, why don't we dedicate it to Dan and Darren? Why don't we dedicate the book to them? And he said, yeah, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea. So then it came down to the wording of the dedication.
Yeah.
You would think, we were writing the preamble to the Constitution. Richard was we would come up with something, and Richard would edit it and say, no. And he was not satisfied with it until he got it down to the fewest number of words and the strongest impact of those words, which is how he wrote. This is exactly how he wrote.
Very minimalistic.
Well, finally, we settled on to Dan and Darren, both legends. That's it. That's the introduction. Okay, perfect, fine. So we got off the phone. A couple minutes later, the phone rings again. It's Richard. I've been thinking about it. I said, no, come on.
Too many words.
No. He said, I've been thinking about it. We decided on to Dan and Darren, both legends. Maybe we should put Darren first. And I said, no. I said, first off, it sounds better to have the one syllable name first. Sounds better to say Dan and Darren instead of to Darren and Dan. I said it's clunkier. I said,
it's got better cadence.
Yeah. I said, it sounds better to start. And I said, and secondly, I said, do you really want to deny Dan Curtis top billing on this one? And he laughed. He chuckled. He said, you're right. He'd come back from the dead and get both of us. So we left it to Dan and Darren, both legends. Now this is, the book comes out, the advanced copy is gets sent to Richard. And I'm talking to Bear, and I said, did he like the book? Did he see the appreciations, And Barry said, did you like the book? I said, what are you talking about? Of course I like the book. I edited it. He said, no. Did you like the dedication? I said, well, of course I like the dedication. We spent hours. He said, look at the dedication.
Oh, no.
So I opened the book and I looked at the dedication page. And Richard double-crossed me. So, I had double-crossed him by putting all of these introductions, this, like, and all this. There was a second dedication. The first one was credited to me, to Dan and Darren, both legends. As much as we both worked on it, it's that dedication is credit to me. Then there's Richard's dedication, which is to my family with love, and Mark Dawidziak and Matthew Bradley with gratitude.
That's cool.
Matthew is another Richard Matheson scholar who has done amazing work on Richard's life and career. So Richard double-crossed me, and I double-crossed him, and oh, yeah, you know, and then he mentioned Matthew and I in a dedication to another book. So, you know, if the universe had just given me an interview with Richard Matheson, that would have been enough. If the universe had given me, you know, a friendship with Richard Matheson, that would have been more than enough.
Yeah.
But the universe then gave me, you know, a collaboration with Richard Matheson. Then it gave me a second collaboration. And then, you know, you think you can't top that. And you could think you're pretty clever and you're pretty bright. But, you know, when you know that Richard Matheson has mentioned you in the dedications to two of his books, that'll take your breath away.
That's pretty cool. That's some pretty good bragging rights.
Take your breath away. And like I said, so, you know, there's no topping that. You know, I mean, I don't know any. I would rather have that than an Oscar or an Emmy or anything else. You know, that
100%.
is the kind of thing you can dine out with on the rest of your life, you know. And then, you know, it actually turned into a third book, as you know, because when this book was published, it was pretty, by the way, I love the cover on this book. The cover was my idea. It was not my execution. I'm not an artist. But at some point I said to Barry, can we make the cover look, I know it's going to be just a regular dust jacket, but can we make it look like old leather that had been worn, like an old Catholic missal that's starting to wear down? It's something that's been pulled out of a vault somewhere. And he said, yeah. So, you know, so I suggested the design, but the artist, I think Harry Morris, did a great job making it
cool.
Actual leather. Isn't that great?
That is cool, especially with Harry Morris doing that. What I mean, a lot of his artwork, of course, is more very abstract and very like this.
So I love the cover on that.
That's gorgeous.
So at that point, you know, that's a very expensive book, and it's a very high-end book. And a lot of people just wanted the one thing they could not have read up to that point, which was the screenplay.
Right.
For I Am Legend. And so it was Barry's idea that we pull that screenplay out and we offer it just as a paperback, a modestly priced paperback that anybody could pick up, any Matheson fan could. So in 2012, we did this little number, which was the I Am Legend screenplay.
Yeah,
and it's just that. It does have a lot of the pictures from the from Bloodlines, but
okay.
Richard wrote a new introduction for this. And Richard was not in the greatest of shape when we did this. So this was one of the last pieces of writing that he did. But the introduction to this was this, but we pulled all the other material out from Bloodlines for this. So this is now, and I think this is still available. And we offered this for $16.95, so it was much more modestly priced. And so basically, I ended up with 3 books with my name on the cover with Richard Matheson, and that ain't too shabby.
Not too shabby at all. I'm going to go ahead, though, and kind of stick my neck a little bit, though, Mark, and say that even though you guys are maybe pretty even as far as the double cross, and I think Richard won the contest.
Richard always won. I mean, that's why I say he was sneaky. That's why I said before he was his sense of humor was sneaky. It was like he had a very funny way of putting things, but it was like he didn't feel the need to push the punchline. He would, so the punchline was sailing past you, in the middle of conversation, and you'd stop thinking, like, that was good. That was really good.
That's awesome.
So as you can see, I did some very deep dives with Richard on certain titles, like Dracula, the making of Dracula, everything that went into that trilogy of terror, certainly. Anything that was on Dan Curtis's career that crossed Richard, because I knew Dan very well as well and did a lot on his career, I tended to go pretty deep on. But there were other things I would have loved to have talked to him about, like his war novel, The Beardless Warriors. I would have loved to have talked about his work on different things. We talked about Twilight Zone. We talked about, the Dan Curtis work, and certainly Kolchak and Dracula and I Am Legend. But there are things we did not talk about, hardly at all.
Yeah, there's just so much.
And that's why somebody like Matthew Bradley is so important, because Matthew does, and others too. I mean, there are other John Scolari. There are so many really good, wonderful Matheson scholars out there. That I when somebody says like, well, you're the authority. No. I am a authority, and I'm an authority on certain titles on Richard's career.
Perfect. Well, you've certainly had the exposure to certainly be much more of an authority than the average person, Mark. So at least there is that. And I know
all of those, as I was saying before, all of those are gifts. All of those are gifts the universe gave me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when Barry from Gauntlet published his book, Leave Yesterday Alone, that Richard wrote when he was like 12, 15 or something. And I mean, his voice was very much there, and I was trying to track down an interview from Richard, and I think at that time it was within his last few years, I believe. So he was very much just not doing that kind of stuff at all, which was totally understandable. But so it's definitely blessed to have had an opportunity that you've had to chat with him as often as you've had.
Well, and again, it's amazing to me. It's almost like when you look back, you realize it's like dominoes falling. You realize that this led to this, led to this, led to this. That if the book I was hoping to do after the Columbo book was done, I was going to do a book on Dashiell Hammett, because that book was published by the Mysterious Press. Obviously, they specialize in mystery, and it seemed like I had a great. I thought I had a great concept, and actually they agreed. We were all set to do that as going to be the option book after the Columbo Phile was done. And right after we sort of had agreed to it, Warner Books, which had purchased the Mysterious Press, came in and said, you're no longer a nonfiction press, you're strictly a fiction press. So they dumped out all of the nonfiction deals they had. So I was at sea at that. I was actually thinking about just basically trying to find another publisher for that book. And that is when the call came from that publisher asking about doing a similar book as the Columbo book on the NightStalker. If the Dashiell Hammett book had gone, it probably would have taken me down a road which would have been more in the mystery realm.
Right.
And it would not have put me back in touch with my kind of my roots, as a monster kid. It was the NightStalker book, which sort of put me on the road. That if I hadn't written the NightStalker, with Night Stalking, because in between Night Stalking and the NightStalker Companion in '97, another small publisher got the rights to do original Kolchak novels from Jeff Rice, and Jeff had written the two original novels. But there had not been an original Kolchak novel in 20 years at that point. And Jeff, the publisher had assumed that Jeff would want to write the books. And Jeff wasn't really up to it at that point. And the publisher says, well, who would you let do it? And he said, I'd let Mark do it, because I really like the way what he did with Night Stalking. And which was quite a leap of faith. I hadn't written fiction at that point. This is to sort of say, well, we're going to let this guy write a whole novel. And I said, whoa, I don't know that I can do that, So I said, I'll tell you what, I'll send you like 5 ideas for a Kolchak novel that I think are pretty good ideas. Yeah. If you like any one of them, I'll take that one to a full. If we all agree there's one good idea in there. And we all kind of liked one idea more than any other. Everybody involved sort of said, yeah, that one. So that book was published and Richard blurbed the book. So which became Grave Secrets.
What a gorgeous cover.
And that's a fully executed colored painting by Ed Silas Smith, who is a wonderful artist.
That's
And
great.
so this became the third Kolchak novel that was published in '94. So without Night Stalking, I don't write
Very
this. Without this, I don't write Night Stalker Companion, or I don't do Richard Matheson's Kolchak scripts. One of it, it's like Dominic. I do a book on Dracula in 2008, then a book on the Twilight Zone, and
Right.
my last book was a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. So I don't know that any of that happens if I don't get pushed into that direction by fate.
Yeah, it is one of those things. I mean, it's a scary thought to really consider what might have been or what might not have been had that one Kolchak been taken away from you there. But thank goodness it wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, but again, you can think you're the master of your ship, the captain of your destiny. You can think all that whatever you want, but when you look back, you kind of look at the patterns of your life. You realize that you weren't really making the decision. You were sort of pushed into you there were certain currents that took you in certain directions where perhaps you were meant to be at that point. So whatever.
So
It certainly led to an area where I wouldn't have been allowed to play otherwise. If it had been. So.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it goes back to, I know certainly a definition of luck that I really enjoy. It's that, when they say there's no such thing as luck, and then you hear other people make a statement, well, luck is really just opportunity meets preparedness.
Oh, yeah.
So it sounds like, and I fully believe in that as well. I think in this case, it sounds like it applies to you where sure it was lucky, but at the same time, it was just the right opportunity at the right time when you're prepared to jump in there, whether you thought you were ready or not.
You always
You're
have to
ready,
be
and
you have to be ready when the luck strikes. That's exactly right. It is one thing, because everybody's going to have luck come along their way at certain points in their life. They're going to have disaster come along at certain times in their life.
Sure.
You have to be prepared to deal with both in certain ways. And where, a lot of people, they're just not ready when the luck comes, and it's like the old, they tell actors that, and it's true. It's like, listen, at some point the right door is going to open and you've got to be ready when that opens. You always got to be ready to deliver the goods at that moment. And where people fall short is usually when the luck happens and they're like, I'm not ready yet. Come back in a week. Well, in a week, it's gone.
Somebody else has used it, has taken it.
Right. Somebody else got your luck, at that point, because they were ready. So, yeah, I do think that there's a certain amount of that is true.
If you don't mind too, Mark, I was hoping to also kind of touch back a little bit about, this is maybe a great segue as well, talking about luck, I suppose, maybe the kind of luck that is a bit more insidious, and that we don't always know it's there until it's gone, I suppose. But regarding I Am Legend, it'll never cease to fascinate me that there's this original script that's sitting out there in your book, as well as Bloodlines, that is just, that's where it lives. It lives in your book. However, we've obviously seen a couple of attempts at adapting it. Apparently there's a sequel in the works now for I Am Legend. And there's something about the sequel and the quote that I read about with the writer for that one, Avica Goldsman, that she mentions there that I'm like, I have to ask Mark this. I'm glad I came across this today. Why has it been so difficult to get this film made the way that Richard Matheson wrote it for Hammer way back in the day? I mean, I've heard different things. I know Barry has mentioned that Matheson, from a lot of senses, was a bit of a pushover. And if he was pressured in certain ways, he would kind of cave into that. So rather than fight them on the rights, they're essentially locked up with Hammer. But in your opinion, why haven't we seen a true adaptation yet of I Am Legend, either through Richard Matheson's script or somebody else that maybe did a treatment on his script?
Well, it has been argued that we have, and it's called A Night of the Living Dead, which is a little bit, but even George Romero, after a while, admitted that he basically ripped off, and they made peace about this. But if you want to see the film that seems to be the truest in spirit, in the feel of the book, you do go to the Night of the Living Dead. It is, basically, because up to that point, zombies didn't act like that. So Romero took Matheson's vampires and how they acted and turned them into zombies for Night of the Living Dead. But the feel of that movie is much closer to the book than any of the screen adaptations are. As Richard once said to me, you could take all of the screen adaptations, put them together, take the best aspects of all three, and you still would not have the book, and you would not have the book.
Right.
If you read the book, it's such an incredible book that it does make you wonder why someone hadn't done. And there are aspects, and it's not to say The Last Man on Earth or The Omega Man or Will Smith's I Am Legend are not entertaining films.
Sure.
They're, each in their own way is an entertaining film. And there are things I admire about all three of those versions greatly. But once again, we're not asking that. It's ironically, it's a lot like the screen adaptations of Dracula. Look how many, from Nosferatu, more than 100 years of screen adaptations of Dracula, and yet not one is the book.
Right.
And I know people will say, what about the miniseries with Louis Jourdan? Well, number one, they do change some big things in that.
Yeah.
Not the least of which is to make Mina and Lucy sisters, which is a major thing to change. But the other thing is about that adaptation is I have never heard one person ever say, you know who my favorite Dracula is? Louis Jourdan. Boy, he nailed it. He's terribly miscast as Dracula. Yeah. And how can that be? You have to be accurate to the character in order for it to be. So basically what I'm saying is we've had, more than 100 years of adaptations of Dracula, countless shots at it, from actors of all type, and nobody yet has done that book. So three, and there's always the sense, that Hollywood knows better, or, any kind of film operator, film producer. Well, we know better, the rare film producer who knows we want to do the book and we want to stick close to the book, and because that's going to be the power of what this film, now Richard knew. It's not like Richard didn't make changes, by the way.
Sure.
Because if you read Night Creatures, you realize he has changed some key, including the ending. He has made...
That was the biggest change.
Yeah, very big change.
And the dog and
I think one of the reasons that, it's because Richard understood that he was working in a different medium, that he was, it's like he didn't make concessions to going from novel to screenplay. But I don't know that there's anything all that odd. I mean, I don't think we all get to sort of be surprised that they did not do a good job with I Am Legend 3 times. That's so what? I mean, look, Hollywood butchered the Maltese Falcon the first 2 times. It was the 3rd time that they got it, and that's because John Huston, as a first-time screenwriter, basically took the book, gave it to his secretary, and said, "Here, type this up into a screenplay." So, it ended up being very, very close to everything that Hammett had written, and dialogue, plot, structure, everything. And everybody looks at that movie now and goes, "Boy, what a model of fidelity to the novel. It really works well."
Yeah, I thought reception just got a raise.
That's rare. I mean, you start thinking about movies which are faithful. Think of the movies where you think to yourself, once I've seen the movie and then I read the book, I cast the book with the people I saw in the movie. That's that good. That's only happened a few times. To Kill a Mockingbird, try to read To Kill a Mockingbird and not see Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch.
Agreed.
The Grapes of Wrath, try to read The Grapes of Wrath and not hear Henry Fonda as Tom Joad. The Maltese Falcon, there's a handful of these, that where that's the case. And even great movies, like Frankenstein. You read Frankenstein, read what Mary Shelley wrote. It's stunning to people because it's the movie and the book are nothing alike. They've got they're only they're hardly first cousins as far as similarity goes. So the idea that it's always a law that they had 3 shots at I Am Legend and they blew each one. That's not a shocking statement. That is in no way shocking. It's not like we all get to go, oh, they had 3 tries and they ruined it. It's like if they had gotten it right at any point, that's what would be shocking. That's
You got that right.
I mean, I remember Harlan Ellison, during the writer's strike, 1988, the long, prolonged writer's strike. And Harlan was I get to be told now, he was my mole inside the Writers Guild when I was out there covering the writer's strike for the Nightmare newspaper chain. And I was during that strike, that Harlan said, if Herman Melville brought Moby Dick to Hollywood, the first thing they would say is, does it have to be a whale? Can it be something else? And that's it. That's it in a nutshell. Can it be? Does it have to be a whale? And that says it.
Yeah, whales they're just not trending on social media enough right now for liking. It's got to be something else. Anglerfish.
And if Richard had been a Harlan, I mean, Barry is right. Richard's personality was not to be the battler that Harlan was. But even if he had, it's not like that would have engendered those people he was dealing with the talent and the insight and the taste to have done a good adaptation of I Am Legend. Sure. I don't think it would have made any difference at all, is what I'm saying. So the wonderful thing about that screenplay and everybody's ability to read it is to see what Richard wanted it to be done, how he wanted it to be done. I think that's a wonderful thing, because you can play the movie out on the screen of your mind as you're reading that screenplay. And you can make it as opulent as you wish. You can make it as rich as you wish. You can make it whatever you wish it to be. You're your own producer, and you can read this screenplay, and you can see exactly what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it. And I think it's, I for as many people who love the ending of the book, or, as powerful as the ending of the book is, that's a very powerful ending in that screenplay too.
It is
the way he frames it. And the last thing, I'm not going to give anything away for anybody.
Sure. Yeah,
read it, but it goes on out of that perfect kind of moment of that kind of, that Richard liked, that was full of atmosphere. And as Richard said to me, one of the great themes of his early writing, particularly his writing in the 1950s, but even on into the 60s, was a sense of isolation and alienation. If you look at the Twilight Zones that deal with it, people often say, the Twilight Zone often deal with issues of alienation and isolation. And almost invariably, they're talking about a Richard Matheson script. You're talking about Agnes Moorehead as the farm woman, all alone, as her house is being invaded by aliens from another planet. You're talking about William Shatner in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet.
Sure.
He's the only one who sees the gremlin, and nobody believes him, thinks he's crazy. So and Richard once said to me, the sense of alienation and isolation was very strong in me.
That does run through a lot of his books, doesn't it? Now that you mention it, I'm thinking, you've got the Shrinking Man. I mean, even beyond the warrior to a point, and
the Shrinking Man, who's literally being isolated, but even until later, where he's even drawn in his adaptations like NightStalker. Carl Kolchak is the loner up against impossible odds. The one person who's trying to say, "Don't you understand? This is a vampire." Yeah. So you see this in Richard's work. You see this in it's in Shrinking Man. It's in and if Neville isn't a He's alone. He's alone in a world of other beings. One of the things that there's no question Vincent Price was miscast in the first film version,
right?
In Last Man on Earth. He's not your idea of an action hero, but Vincent Price still brought a lot to that role. And that scene where he's in the house alone and he's watching home movies. And he is watching his wife and daughter, and he's scenes at a circus, and he starts to laugh because he remembers, and he starts to laugh, and the laughter starts to get stronger and stronger, and then it turns into crying, hysterical crying, because of this overpowering sense of loss and being alone. It's a beautiful scene. It is Vincent Price puts that scene over. That's why I say, about how there's each of the versions that you could admire. Right. So, Charlton Heston was more believable as an action star. But that script has less to do with I Am Legend than the first film does. So you see bits and pieces in all of this, but I think Richard was right when he said to me once that you could take all three versions, put them together, take the best, and you still would not have a very good movie. In his mind, a good adaptation. Let me not say a good movie, because you can enjoy it
right
for what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I like the Will Smith movie too, but it was no I Am Legend. There weren't even vampires, and I mean, there's rules, but it was great.
If you can divorce yourself from it being an adaptation of I Am Legend,
that's the key.
It's like The Shining. If you can divorce yourself from it, because it ain't the book. I mean, if you love the book and you love everything that works in the book, if you watch The Shining just as its own thing, which it is,
right,
you can enjoy it immensely. But once you start saying, is this? It's two different questions. Is it a good movie, and is it a good adaptation? Those are two different questions, and it's rare. It's rare that both happen, where you get both a good movie and it's also a good adaptation. That's faithful in spirit, that is faithful in tone, that is faithful all the way around. And like I said, just think about the number of times that happens. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Silence of the Lambs is an awfully good movie.
Absolutely.
So it's not to say it does not happen. Schindler's List. No arguments here. There are many a film which work.
Shawshank Redemption. There's a couple, but they don't happen too often though.
Having written an entire book on that film, I will tend to agree with you.
Yeah, that was my lightning in a bottle moment. When I had a chance to talk to Frank about that with what Barry did with his script work. But I found one thing I want to ask you about too, like as I mentioned, especially when I was reading that article, I think it was from Variety or something, regarding the sequel to I Am Legend, and it is interesting because, as you were saying, from Matheson's own take, that you kind of string them all together. There's stuff that you're going to like about each one of them. And I would almost find it ironic that a huge part so far is that nobody seems to be getting the ending of this film quite right. And I find it interesting that the Goldsman, the writer for I Am Legend, the Will Smith version of it, is citing that she feels that there's going to be a lot more, I guess, fidelity to the text as she states it in the sequel, and that they're in fact going to work on adapting the ending of I Am Legend into the sequel, which I find is kind of fascinating, and I'd love to see what they can do with that. But I find that there just seems to be a certain amount of irony in there where they can't seem to get it right as far as a close adaptation. And wouldn't that be something? The one thing they finally got right was the ending of the book.
There are times when you just sort of throw up your hands and say, why don't they just do the book?
Right.
I mean, as we have said on Dracula, why doesn't somebody just do the book? And I think
it has to be a series.
With Dracula, it would have to be a miniseries. Yeah, I agree. I think Dracula's way too big. And but another part of this is that the culture has sort of outrun the book too. I mean, and the reason I say that is that it does go back to Night of the Living Dead. Richard wrote what is not only the most influential vampire novel since Dracula, he also wrote the book that ultimately had the most profound influence on zombie storytelling. Because again, zombies didn't act that way.
Right.
The zombies of Night of the Living Dead is a direct line straight into The Walking Dead. I mean, you don't get The Walking Dead and the zombies in there acting the way they do without Night of the Living Dead, but none of those have anything to do with the original zombie legends and folklore. And if you look at zombie movies before Night of the Living Dead, that's not how any of the folklore goes.
Right. The whole eat your brains thing. I mean, that never came up with.
So, the whole idea of the sort of the lurking masses, the relentless, mass of beings, that's right out of I Am Legend. So I Am Legend is in some ways has the most important story as far as vampire storytelling going forward and zombie storytelling ultimately. So, I mean, once you get to Night of the Living Dead, it sort of co-opts the, what Richard had done. And that's what I meant by the pop culture sort of overtaken. Now, the one thing that can reclaim that story, the one thing that I think can ultimately reclaim that story is the character of Neville, because Neville is a great character. He's an amazing character. And if you could find that magic combination, and this is hard for Hollywood to do too, but if you can find the magic combination of the right actor playing that part, that could reclaim the story. To me, that's that's the one and only thing that can reclaim the story, is to remember, you can talk about all the zombies you want, all the action stuff you want, all the stuff that's in there, the apocalyptic stuff, all of that stuff. Yes, it all comes along for the ride. But Richard understood something which most great writers do, and most great people who can then adapt their work into television and film, particularly television. And I think this is why his work had more resonance in television. Okay. Character, character, character. Plot follows character, not the other way around.
Right.
Character follows plot. They're just chess pieces being moved around a board, and it can be plugged in anywhere. Character decides how things go. Character decides how plot goes. Character decides what decisions get made. Neville is a great character. He's an endlessly fascinating character. And if somebody would really do the work on that and understand that that's the power of the book, if you do not care about Robert Neville, you don't care about the book.
Exactly. Yeah.
If you do not care about this guy, if you're not invested in him as a character, then, why are you there? I mean, so I think you could find just the perfect actor to do it. Somebody who had the subtlety and the shadings of what Vincent Price did, the believability as an action hero that Heston had, some of the irony and sly humor that Will Smith had. If you could have somebody who sort of had all of that and put it together as a character, I think that's the one thing that could reclaim this.
Who do you think would be a good fit? Because I know I've waffled back and forth. Tim Robbins comes to mind, just from what he did in Shawshank, speaking of which.
30 years ago, it's like when people say, he'd make a great Kolchak, Bryan Cranston. I say, yes, Bryan Cranston 30 years ago would have made a great.
Exactly.
Yeah. Bryan is much older than Darren now was when he first played the role. It's just, and so that is a very good question. That is a very, very, you need somebody who is, a good actor, believable in an action role, has screen presence, obviously, because they're going to have to carry the movie, young enough to be believable as an action hero, old enough to look like, they had seen a lot of life and had been kicked around a bit. That's a hard combination to find.
It really is. And I mean, I guess in a sense that's, from how I'm looking at it, the challenge itself is almost ironic in a way, because you want somebody, I mean, we could think about, like you said, alluded to, we could think of all these older actors because they've proven themselves to be able to carry that kind of a role off, but then you almost have to put somebody in there where they've just simply hinted at their ability, have a chance to do it, and then just take that ability and run with it and surprise us all. And I think that's so tough to be able to find somebody that can do that.
But whoever would do it would have one great advantage, and that is nobody has claimed the role yet.
Right.
You're not going to be compared. It's like, is anybody who plays Kolchak is going to be compared to Darren McGavin.
Right.
And that's a tough act to follow. Anybody who might play Columbo is going to be compared to Peter Falk. It's not like anybody looks at Vincent Price and says, well, nobody can play that after Vincent played it. Oh, no. Or the Heston or Will Smith. Nobody has made that role their own yet.
It's a good point.
And that actually opens up a big window of opportunity for somebody, because nobody is going to say, oh, well, nobody can follow that person in that role. We haven't seen the definitive Neville yet.
Yeah, and I think if they go that way too, they're almost going to have to go into a different medium like TV with it, because we've already seen what they can do in films, and I don't think anybody would want to create something that's going to be very obviously compared to the I Am Legend films, whether they're completely different or very similar. I think it would just have to be.
Barriers are gone now anyway, you know.
Yeah.
And it's certainly true that probably the best horror storytelling, with notable exceptions, have been on the TV side over the last, 30 years. You know, that if most of the great advances, in the 90s, things like the X-Files and Buffy, moving into, the new stuff like the early seasons of American Horror Story, or the early seasons of The Walking Dead. You look at, where all of the really advances in this were done was really on the TV side. So, and now, with the rise of streaming, and you then see, things like Stranger Things and, Dark Mirror and various things. And you now see well, really those walls which used to exist don't exist anymore.
Right.
Well, it could be done anywhere. It could be done anywhere at any point. It could be done at both simultaneously. You could have it on Netflix and in the theaters at the same time.
And it's the perfect timing to do it too, because, of course, with streaming, like it's the way it's been for several years now, we don't have to wait a week or so or to find time for it to come on TV next week or whatever. We can just wait till they're all available, binge it all. We get the full immersion of an experience where we don't have to try and remember what happened before, because every segment will be focused, but we'd be able to watch it all together in one big binge. And I think it'd be the perfect stage for this.
There are so many works of Richard's in addition to that, there are things that I like about What Dreams May Come, for instance, but what an opportunity to do that book. And it's,
right.
As much as I like Robin Williams, that movie it fell far, far short of that book. And that was a very important book to Richard. Few books meant more to Richard than What Dreams May Come.
Remember him talking a lot about that, literally changing people's lives, and people would write them saying that they saved their lives or they saved their memory of somebody and really helped them through some tough times.
Yeah. Richard got some powerful, I don't know what the word is. Endorsement seems a little mild as a word to say, but whatever it is, and I've stolen this line from him any number of times, but I remember I passed a compliment on to him that another writer had said to me about him. And I said, I think you really need to hear this, because, I would hate to say I never told you this, but so-and-so said, and he was quiet. We're on the phone at the time, and he was quiet. He didn't respond. And I said, does it embarrass you to hear praise like that? And he said, this is what I was saying before about how he could be sneaky funny. He said, no, you can't hear that kind of thing too often. And I've stolen that line many, many times.
That's great.
I really like this that you did. And I always say, like, well, you can't. Sometimes I credit it to Richard, sometimes I don't. But you can't hear that kind of thing too often. That's exactly right. When you're a writer, you send that stuff out. You say, and you don't know what connections you're making. You don't know whether you're having an impact or not. And you're lucky. Ray Bradbury said, in one of his essays on writing, Ray Bradbury said, what is the real reward for a writer? Isn't it that moment when somebody comes up to you and says, I read your latest story and it was really fine. It was really wonderful. Isn't that the moment we all live for? Yeah, it is. That's what I was saying before about more than awards or anything like that. It's that kind of a thing that are truly, and not to say Richard got his share of awards. I mean, Richard won his share.
Sure.
His work was certainly recognized from that standpoint, but I think Richard would probably have agreed that the true rewards were that kind of thing where people would write him or people would say, imagine, knowing that Robert Bloch said that about your writing. To me, that's like one of the highest. And he meant it. He meant it. He wasn't just, blowing smoke. He wasn't just, and again, Richard's name wasn't even on the radar, during that conversation.
Yeah, I definitely feel like Richard Matheson is, he's a genre of his own self, and somebody that we could spend hours dissecting and talking about, and still probably
Oh, yeah.
touch the surface. But one of the things here, and correct me if I'm wrong, or tell me if you think this is really a fair statement to make at all, Mark, but everything that I've heard you talk about and some of the insightful opinions that you have regarding I Am Legend, the script, the book, the attempts to adapt it, or I shouldn't say the attempts to adapt it, but the adaptations that were made, despite how far away or how close to it the film was, or to the book. But what I'm gathering from all of that is that it almost seems like it's just as well that nobody has actually come up, including Richard Matheson himself, has actually had a film adapted super close to the novel that's been a faithful adaptation of the novel. It almost seems like that's just as well in order for the book itself to live on the way it needs to live on without anybody or any I guess outside influences really altering our perception or memory of that book, especially now as more generations come along, discover Richard Matheson, read the book themselves, and have the book as it's one true adaptation. Do you think that's a fair statement, or do you think that it's important to have a close adaptation of this?
So I think that's abundantly the book wins. In that respect, the book is triumphant. So it's sort of like the story you may have known this. Know the story. This is one of Stephen King's favorite stories. But
yeah,
when James Cain was, one of the great kind of noir writers of the 40s. And such, and towards the end of his life, he was living in a small house in Maryland, and a reporter had tracked him down. And the reporter at one point said, "Well, doesn't it bother you, Mr. Cain, the way Hollywood mangles all your books?" And Cain said, "Come here." And he took the guy into another room, and there was a shelf with all of Cain's books on it. And he said, "See, there they are. They're not mangled. They're in perfect condition." And Stephen King loves that story, and I do too, because it's true. You can make a lot of bad. People will say, "Well, it's going to ruin the book." Well, you're going to ruin the book.
Yeah.
Ruin the book. I mean, you can make 100 bad versions of I Am Legend, and it's not going to touch the book. The book is there. It's a survivor. Books are crafty little survivors. They survive through decades and centuries. So no, I think what you're saying is abundantly fair and abundantly true, and also that nothing has come along to supersede our impression of that. Right. I mean, to this day, if you say The Godfather, people will think of the film before they will think of Mario Puzo's book.
Right.
It has superseded in our minds that it was a book first and a movie second. It's for most people, it's a movie, and it's a movie experience. So I do think that's fair, and I do think that's true.
Good. No, I'm very happy to hear you say that, because certainly one of my concerns is that people might say go off and watch the Will Smith version, which I think it's a great movie, or I don't know if I'd say it's a great movie. That's a stretch, but it's a good movie, but it's not
entertaining movie.
Yeah, exactly, entertaining movie, and
like Omega Man is a very entertaining movie.
Mm-hmm.
There's there are things in Omega Man which are just very good. Yeah, and one of the reasons Omega Man turned out the way it did was because Charlton Heston didn't realize there had been an earlier version. He had read the book, he loved the book, and he talked to director Sam Peckinpah, who was a friend of his, about making a faithful adaptation of I Am Legend, and that was there. So they took it, I think, to Warner Brothers, and somebody said like, "Well, how is this going to differ from the Vincent Price version?" And Heston was like, "What do you mean?"
What?
They arranged for a screening, and they watched the Vincent Price version, and they realized that was only a few years before. You're not even talking of a difference of 10 years at this point. So they realized they had to distance themselves from what they did, and then they lost Sam Peckinpah, which I think is an immense loss. Although Boris Sagal was a wonderful director. But they came up with a vision, and they really did feel like they needed to distance themselves from what The Last Man on Earth was. So there were reasons kind of for the things turning out the way they did. But you could be doing it both simultaneously. You could have it on Netflix and in the theaters at the same time.
And it's the perfect timing to do it too, because, of course, with streaming, like it's the way it's been for several years now, we don't have to wait a week or so or to find time for it to come on TV next week, or whatever. We can just wait till they're all available, binge it all. We get the full immersion of an experience where we don't have to try and remember what happened before, because every segment will be focused, but we'd be able to watch it all together in one big binge. And I think it'd be the perfect stage for this.
There are so many works of Richard's, in addition to that, there are things that I like about What Dreams May Come, for instance, but what an opportunity to do that book. And it's
right.
As much as I like Robin Williams, that movie it fell far, far short of that book. And that was a very important book to Richard. Few books meant more to Richard than What Dreams May Come.
Remember him talking a lot about that, literally changing people's lives, and people would write them saying that they saved their lives or they saved their memory of somebody and really helped them through some tough times.
Richard got some powerful, I don't know what the word is. Endorsement seems a little mild as a word to say, but whatever it is, and I've stolen this line from him any number of times, but I remember I passed a compliment on to him that another writer had said to me about him. And I said, I think you really need to hear this, because, I would hate to say I never told you this, but so-and-so said, and he was quiet. We're on the phone at the time, and he was quiet. He didn't respond. And I said, does it embarrass you to hear praise like that? And he said, this is what I was saying before about how he could be sneaky funny. He said, no, you can't hear that kind of thing too often. And I've stolen that line many, many times.
That's great.
I really like this that you did. And I always say, like, well, you can't. Sometimes I credit it to Richard, sometimes I don't. But you can't hear that kind of thing too often. That's exactly right. When you're a writer, you send that stuff out, you say, and you don't know what connections you're making. You don't know whether you're having an impact or not. And you're lucky. Ray Bradbury said, in one of his essays on writing, Ray Bradbury said, what is the real reward for a writer? Isn't it that moment when somebody comes up to you and says, I read your latest story and it was really fine. It was really wonderful. Isn't that the moment we all live for? Yeah, it is. That's what I was saying before about more than awards or anything like that. It's that kind of a thing that are truly, and not to say Richard got his share of awards. I mean, Richard won his share.
Sure.
His work was certainly recognized from that standpoint, but I think Richard would probably have agreed that the true rewards were that kind of thing where people would write him or people would say, imagine, knowing that Robert Bloch said that about your writing. And to me, that's like one of the highest. He meant it. He meant it. He wasn't just, blowing smoke. He wasn't just, and again, Richard's name wasn't even on the radar, during that conversation.
Do you mind, Mark, would I be able to pause this just for 1 second? I just have to use the facilities real quick, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Do we have much more that you want to cover here? Because it's getting on to 2:30 here.
Oh, holy smokes, it is too. Yeah, actually, that's fine.
If you have something you really, really want to go ahead and come on back.
Okay, sure. I appreciate that. I'm going to just hit pause really quick.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mark. There we go. So yeah, I definitely feel like, Richard Matheson is, he's a genre of his own self, and somebody that we could spend hours dissecting and talking about and still probably, touch the surface. But I guess one of the things here, and correct me if I'm wrong, or tell me if you think this is really a fair statement to make at all, Mark, but everything that I've heard you talk about and some of the insightful opinions that you have regarding I Am Legend, the script, the book, the attempts to adapt it, or I shouldn't say the attempts to adapt it, but the adaptations that were made, despite how far away or how close to it the film was, or to the book. But what I'm gathering from all of that is that it almost seems like it's just as well that nobody has actually come up, including Richard Matheson himself, has actually had a film adapted super close to the novel that's been a faithful adaptation of the novel. It almost seems like that's just as well in order for the book itself to live on the way it needs to live on without anybody or any I guess outside influences really altering our perception or memory of that book, especially now as more generations come along, discover Richard Matheson, read the book themselves, and have the book as it's only one true adaptation. Do you think that's a fair statement, or do you think that it's important to have a close adaptation of this?
So I think that's abundantly. The book wins, in that respect. The book is triumphant. So it's sort of like the story. You may have known this. Know the story. This is one of Stephen King's favorite stories. But
yeah,
when James Cain was, one of the great kind of noir writers of the 40s. And such, and towards the end of his life, he was living in a small house in Maryland, and a reporter had tracked him down. And the reporter at one point said, "Well, doesn't it bother you, Mr. Cain, the way Hollywood mangles all your books?" And Cain said, "Come here." And he took the guy into another room, and there was a shelf with all of Cain's books on it. And he said, "See, there they are. They're not mangled. They're in perfect condition." And Stephen King loves that story, and I do too, because it's true. You can make a lot of bad. People will say, "Well, it's going to ruin the book." Well, you can't ruin the book.
Yeah,
Ruin the book. I mean, you can make 100 bad versions of I Am Legend, and it's not going to touch the book. The book is there. It's a survivor. Books are crafty little survivors. They survive through decades and centuries. So no, I think what you're saying is abundantly fair and abundantly true, and also that nothing has come along to supersede our impression of that. Right. I mean, to this day, if you say The Godfather, people will think of the film before they will think of Mario Puzo's book.
Right.
It has superseded in our minds that it was a book first and a movie second. It's for most people, it's a movie, and it's a movie experience. So I do think that's fair, and I do think that's true.
Good. No, I'm very happy to hear you say that, because certainly one of my concerns is that people might say go off and watch the Will Smith version, which I think it's a great movie, or I don't know if I'd say it's a great movie. That's a stretch, but it's a good movie, but it's not
an entertaining movie.
Yeah, exactly, entertaining movie, and
like Omega Man is a very entertaining movie.
Mm-hmm.
There's there are things in Omega Man which are just very good. Yeah, one of the reasons Omega Man turned out the way it did was because Charlton Heston didn't realize there had been an earlier version. He had read the book, he loved the book, and he talked to director Sam Peckinpah, who was a friend of his, about making a faithful adaptation of I Am Legend, and that was there. So they took it, I think, to Warner Brothers, and somebody said like, "Well, how is this going to differ from the Vincent Price version?" And Heston was like, "What do you mean?"
What?
He arranged for a screening, and they watched the Vincent Price version, and they realized that was only a few years before. You're not even talking of a difference of 10 years at this point. So they realized they had to distance themselves from what they did, and then they lost Sam Peckinpah, which I think is an immense loss. Although Boris Segal was a wonderful director. But they came up with a vision, and they really did feel like they needed to distance themselves from what The Last Man on Earth was. So there were reasons kind of for the things turning out the way they did. But but I think your point is sound. I think in all things the book is triumphant. And that's a wonderful thing about horror fans. I've always noticed that, as opposed to other genres, horror fans, not all, but many of them, will give a chance to something, from previous generations and decades. If somebody say, "Well, You ever read I Am Legend? Oh, you got to read I Am Legend. They may do that. They may give it a try. I mean, it's like in other realms, like comedy dates very, very fast. That certain comedy that used to be basic rite of passage for anybody who it would have been unthinkable to say you were a comedy fan and had never seen a W.C. Fields film or a Marx Brothers movie. Now, most people don't know who the Marx Brothers are or who the W.C. Fields is. And it's perfectly okay to say you're a comedy fan and have no idea who they are. And that would, horror is, it's a little bit more in touch with its roots. And
I would agree with that for sure.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things about it is that, it's possible to be a horror fan of things today. And people will actually sometimes shame you into saying, you've never seen Christopher Lee's Dracula. Are you kidding? You've never seen Body Snatchers?
You're not a real horror fan.
Yeah, people actually get shamed and pushed into seeing things that, they might not otherwise. And going all the way back to silent movies.
I'm laughing, but it's so true, and sometimes it's frustrating, but it's the comedic portion of
one of the wonderful things about the genre is that that doesn't tend to happen in other forms, and even in music and things like that, where you would have never said, well, I'm a fan of this and not known. Horror fans are almost like art fans, where you're like, well, if you're an art fan, if you're great art, it would be unthinkable that you wouldn't know the history of the art form and the history of the art form, and that you're like, well, this takes you back to Rembrandt, or this takes you back to Van Gogh, or whatever. Yeah. We, in the horror realm, there's still, an appreciation, and we're still reading the grand masters from the 19th century. We're still reading Shelley and Poe and Stoker and Stevenson and the guys who sort of, brought this storytelling form into the modern era. We're still reading them, and we're still acknowledge their influence and their presence. And Richard is kind of one of the middle guys there. He's sort of like, in that group that's standing there between those people who brought horror into the modern era in the 19th century, and then what's going to happen at the end of the 20th century with Stephen King and Anne Rice and all of the people who turned horror into bestsellers. That it's a common thing to find on the bestseller list, or it's a common thing to find as a blockbuster film at a theater, or a top-rated one of the most talked about TV show of all time. That's why he's so incredibly influential, is that standing between those, he influenced almost everything going forward,
including his own influencers.
Yes, right, exactly. Yeah. So, well, one of the things, oddly enough, I didn't talk to Richard a lot about was his Poe adaptations. I would have, if I could go back and talk to him about something, having written a biography of Poe, I would have loved to have gone a little deeper on those Corman films. With him, but there you go. That there's one of the things which I didn't go deep enough with him on at the time.
Yeah, that's it's a heck of a thing that you're able to go as deep as you are with other things, and plus, I'm sure the knowledge that you got from all the conversations and collaborations you had with him I think it's just inevitably going to stem and think, well, we talked about this and we accomplished this together. What if?
Yeah. Well. I don't tend to what if much, and I don't tend to, we got what we got.
Yeah.
And, and I'm extraordinarily appreciative. I'm not, one to sort of say, oh, I should have done, should have, would have, could have. That's a slippery slope, Yeah. So I don't tend to go there. With anything, it's like, people say, well, it's a shame we've never had a great film version of Dracula or I Am Legend. Like, well, it is what it is.
Sure.
I don't really, sit and lament that all that often.
Right, because I suppose in a sense, at the end of the day, it's that once you've got that perfect adaptation, where do you go from there? Then you just get all these wacky interpretations.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So, is that a big part of my Poe biography is examining the mystery of his death. And, if we ever could definitively solve that mystery, we would lose more than we would gain. We would lose a lot of romanticism and appeal and fascination that we have with Poe. So I agree with that. So like I said, I don't spend a lot of time, the only thing I wish I wish that Richard's writing would be, I want to say taken more seriously, but I wish that people understood that, because he spent a lot of his time, and he knew this, by the way, he understood this. The one term that Richard absolutely hated was being described as a horror writer.
Right.
And it's not because he wasn't proud of what he'd done in the horror field. And it wasn't because he wasn't, but he felt like it limited who he was and what he was. Just the way Harlan hated it when somebody described him as a science fiction writer. Harlan didn't mind if you said Harlan Ellison, who has written landmark science fiction. That was fine with Harlan. But when you turned it into an adjective that preceded his name and said science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, he hated that because it was limiting. It was,
right.
Part of what I've done is science fiction. I've written all these other things. And so, Harlan would go to war if you said that he was a science fiction writer. And similarly, Richard hated being called a horror writer. Also because the definition of horror in his lifetime shifted in the 70s and 80s into, people started to think that horror meant slasher movies, and then later torture porn movies. And that's what the definition of horror was to most people, that he sort of ran away from the label. He basically said, and he thought that when he died, the obituaries would say science fiction writer Richard Matheson. And, in truth, and I wrote a piece when Richard died. It was a difficult piece to write, but I did. And, one of the things I said is that, well, it really should say, great American writer. That's really should be the definition.
Yeah.
And we're not even getting into the reasons because of how he wrote, his style, his influence, his impact. It's just, as Robert Bloch said, it is a model for learning how to write, and I would echo Robert Bloch's sentiment and tell people, say, if you want to learn how to write, read Richard Matheson. It'll be a clinic. It will be an absolute clinic in how to write.
Yeah, it's like he is legend, and the clues are all the way through his work. And maybe that's not a bad place to kind of tie off things, Mark, with you today. And again, thank you so much for all of your time and your insight. This has been fantastic. I love it when I can throw somebody a bone and just sit back and just enjoy the show myself. Like, this has been fantastic and really insightful.
Well, you got me on a favorite topic, so.
Perfect. Well, I hope I can bring you back on this favorite topic again sometime. I think that one episode of the show here is just not enough to really dig deep into it.
Well, like I said, you could dive deep. We could have spent this whole time talking about nothing but NightStalker and Kolchak. We could have spent
so much there.
Nothing but the Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
we could have spent nothing but the Roger Corman movies. We could have talked about his work in the TV movie field. We could talk about his short stories. We could have talked. That's why I say when you start putting everything together, it's like Richard was not the household name that Ray Bradbury became.
No.
If one writer in that, what they call the school, the group, that was these writers who sort of gravitated around Ray Bradbury in California, people like Charles Beaumont and Richard and later Robert Bloch and Harlan and Jack Finney. If you look at those guys, Ray was the one who became the household name. No question about it. But in my mind, Richard's impact is as important and should be recognized as something. Ray was the one it was okay to teach in high school and then, do college courses on and study his writing and study it academically and study, but Richard's work bears that kind of attention as well, merits that kind of attention as well.
Okay. And I know this is going to be a really tough question to ask you, but what would you say to somebody who asks you, what's a good place or a couple of good places to start with Richard Matheson that I think will give me a general idea of his style so that it'll arm me better with what I should read of his next?
Well, I think a very good starting place would be either, if you're up to jumping into the deep end of the pool, I Am Legend, because I Am Legend is not a long book. It is not a, it's almost like a long short story in a way.
Right.
So it's a very accessible book. It's a very accessible read. It's very easy to find. So, certainly I Am Legend would be a very good place to start to really test it. And then if not that, just a good basic collection of Richard's short stories, something that would have something in it like Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, some of the great short stories that were collected over the years. There's some very good anthologies of Richard's work, collections of Richard's work. And I think either of those would be good starting places, would be wonderful starting places. But as with any great writer, when somebody asks that question, yes, I mean, another part of my life, I'm something of a Mark Twain scholar, and 5 of my books are on Mark Twain. And sometimes I'll, when I give a talk about Mark Twain, and I perform as Mark Twain, can you tell? But when, I get through, somebody will come up and say, I've never read much Twain. Where should I start? And, the answer that I give for Twain it's the same that I would give for Poe, and it's the same that I would give for Richard. Start anywhere.
Just get started.
Doesn't matter where you start. One is going to lead you to somewhere else. It's not like if you read Bid Time Return, which was made into Somewhere in Time, that you're going to be reading something that's going to make you go, well, okay, now I'm done with Richard Matheson. You're going to be intrigued enough to go on to something else. So it's a pretty impressive shelf of work, And I would say that is also true about a lot of remember, because the television adaptations, they're a wonderful starter drug to all of this. The Twilight Zone episodes, they hold up very, very well. There are no flies on those Twilight Zone episodes. No. So if you want to see some of Richard's work, what he was capable of as a writer, and not only because a lot of those stuff was based on his stories. So you get a sense of what he is as a writer for the page, but you also get a sense of how skilled he was as somebody writing for the screen. So, you certainly the Twilight Zone episodes, any of the TV movies, something like Trilogy of Terror, or NightStalker, or I think any of those would Duel.
The list really does go on, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, and it's amazing how broad the work is. Again, you could sort of say, did Richard Matheson write great horror? Well, yes, he did. Did he write science fiction? Yes, he did. But you're only getting, one of the things that I always say, his work with Roger Corman, and everybody kind of tended to lump that into the horror stuff because he was doing Poe adaptations. But really, Richard was writing comedy a lot of the times, not all of it. But if you look at The Raven, his adaptation of The Raven, if you look at especially if you look at Comedy of Terrors, those are very funny movies, and nobody thinks of Richard Matheson as a comedy writer, but he was. Yeah. In another life, in another way of his life, maybe Richard would have written a lot of more comedy if he'd been given the opportunity to, because he's got some very funny stuff. Some of the short stories are very funny.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what makes it work really well for his stories too is that he really does write very much from the heart. And I think certainly, as with comedy being such a part of his personality, I think it's almost impossible for him not to write or kind of stitch in some comedy with his work.
All great horror writers pretty much had great senses of humor. It's almost impossible. As Stephen King said, and Robert Bloch said, humor and horror are flip sides of the same coin.
Absolutely.
That they both are metaphoric devices we use to deal with uncomfortable subjects, difficult subjects, big subjects. And we wrap our mind around them either by screaming in laughter or screaming in terror. And so almost every great horror writer, including Poe, had a terrific sense of humor, and they usually don't get credit for it. But if you know anything about writing horror, it's almost standard equipment for writing horror that you have a good sense of humor.
I would say that's very true. Yeah, I certainly with I've always said that the horror writers have always been some of the most humblest, outstanding, kindest people that I've ever met, because I think these are the people that get to exercise their fears, their demons, and
So Stephen King told
wonderful ways.
exactly what to, in one of the interviews I did with Stephen King, he said that that horror writing is cathartic, that basically we work through our nightmares and then we're through with them. We give them to you. It's your problem now. We're done with them. We've already worked through our problems. And I think there is a certain sense to that. But, I agree that most horror people, not just writers, by the way, but the actors who, are in horror or the directors, I think they tend to be very down-to-earth people. I think they'd be very much in touch with them. That has been my, and over the last 50 years, I've gotten to interview almost every leading horror practitioner on the planet, at one point or another. And there's no group I'd rather talk to than them. Yeah. And that goes all the way back to the old school people like Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, and working your way, forward into the writers like Stephen King and Anne Rice, and right on through. I think that they're probably my favorite group of people that I've ever talked to.
Yeah, me as well. I've never. Yeah, I mean, there's always the odd exception, but as a general rule, it's yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Right.
We have to do this again sometime.
Well, I'm a tough get. You have to ask me. So
perfect. Well, I will look forward to asking you again. Thank you so much, and we will definitely talk to you soon. We will keep in touch.
All right, sounds good.